Now, it is my great pleasure to welcome and introduce our keynote speaker for today, Carl Leitner. Dr. Leitner is the Technical Officer of Architecture and Informatics at WHO's Digital Health and Innovation Team, where he leads the use of standards for the Smart Guidelines approach. Also serves as the business owner for the Global Digital Health Certification Network. Carl is a strong advocate for how open source, FHIR-based digital innovations can serve communities everywhere. Now, please join me with a raucous round of applause for our keynote, Carl Leitner.
I hope I can match Dan's energy, but I will fail. But I wanted to thank you all today for, first, obviously the opportunity to be here, but really to thank you as a community. We've been doing a lot of work in FHIR for several years, many years, but a lot of it's been behind the scenes, been lurking, but we've been taking and extrapolating and taking things from you as a community, and we really appreciate all of your efforts going forward. So I want to introduce today some of the work that we're doing around smart guidelines, just so you have some better context, but also to see where some of the work that you have done already is actually building towards the smart guidelines work, as well as sort of highlight some of the opportunities that you can contribute and can collaborate with us going forward. So I won't be able to, in this keynote, talk about everything that we're doing, so I just want to give a high-level overview of what we're doing and just sort of contextualize what WHO is and how we work. Because, I think a lot of people have heard of WHO, but actually how WHO functions is a little bit maybe new to people. So maybe just to start, so WHO is one of the primary things that we do is develop normative guidance. And we don't need to go into the details, but we have norms and standards like, okay, what's the best immunization schedule for malaria, or all of these sort of normative, scientific-based guidelines that countries adopt. We also produce data, so that can be reporting to WHO, aggregate reporting of health goals, but it's also data standards. So the International Classification of Diseases is WHO, it's a data standard. And then research, innovation, horizon scanning, sort of what's coming new, what are things that countries are interested in. We don't necessarily work with specific countries, but we try to say, in aggregate, what are tools and guidelines across countries that will be generally useful. So we can think of an 80-20% rule in terms of guideline development, and what we really want to do is to move from sort of narrative guidelines where you should have such and such immunization schedule to something computable, and that's where FHIR and standards comes in. So really what happens is a sort of structured process that we see typically is that WHO will develop those guidelines. These can take several years because if you go through all the scientific evidence, there's a formal process to this. As we develop and publish these guidelines, then ministries of health will either adapt these or adopt these wholesale. And so the WHO guidelines end up being the policies, the health policies for many countries. And if we think about how we implement these in digital systems, well, then the technology partners come in, they translate these national policies into digital solutions before they get out to the health workforce and health service users. But if you think about that process, you have the software developers who are 2 steps removed from the actual guideline development, right? And how do they understand if there's a question about a narrative or a guideline, they don't really have the ability to go back to those initial clinical subject matter experts. And so we have a bit of a process problem here, both in terms of feedback cycles, but also time. These are very consuming processes. And we think the technology partners, you go through your requirements gathering, you try to translate a narrative document into something that a software developer can use. Well, that is also very expensive, right? And so software vendors are doing this again and again and again. So why are we doing this? Like can we just do this once up front and at least get most of the way there in terms of requirements? And so these are some of these things that we're trying to solve with sort of smart guidelines approach. So a smart guideline is really sort of the health content. So the specific immunization schedule coming from the normative recommendations. Then the specific digital health intervention, like, we want to increase adherence for immunization, so we're going to go through and try to identify the cohort of the population that hasn't been immunized, and we will send targeted communications. That's a specific intervention. And then the digital application of actually how this is done in systems. So all of these things, sort of 3 things come together for a specific intervention in the country, but in smart guidelines is sort of our structured way to share that content. So starting sort of from the narrative, that these are PDFs, these are documents that are published by WHO as books. You know, you can see an example of this is a iron and folic acid supplement for antenatal care. Right? This is how it's written, right? So it's fairly clear, you know, from the clinician side, but from the developer side, you know, okay, what are the edge cases? You know, there's always like little questions here and there, and exactly where does this fit in? And we want to contextualize this. So we now go into more structured, basically business requirements documentation. The second level is L2 level. So this is business process diagrams. These are decision support tables. These are user actor system personas. Just typical things that you want as a software developer before you start actually developing. And that's sort of the L2. L3, this next layer is where we get, I think, the more exciting thing. Okay. Where we get into FHIR and the implementation guide. So how do we take these structured business requirements documents and make something computable out of that? And that's what we use implementation guides for. We'll see some specific examples of this, of taking in a minute, but we really want to say, how can we ease that process from the business analysts where they're interfacing with the SMEs to the software developer so that they have clear guidance and guidelines. Once we've gotten the IGs, then we get into actual software tools, the executable side, and everybody has to talk about AI, so that's the fifth layer, the dynamic machine learning thing. So the machine learning AI has been a part of our framework since we started Smart Guidelines 5 or more years ago. We've always sort of, well, L5 is coming, machine learning AI is coming. We'll think about it in the future. We no longer have that luxury, right? We have to figure out what we're doing. And so, but what the plan for and the strategy has been, we really focus on that machine readable spot. If you think about how we represent knowledge, how do we make it computable, then at least we have some ways to actually a better way to interface with these AI agents, to describe the information that we want and the information we need. We also can more easily produce training data sets. So we're sort of preparing and laying the groundwork for these future use cases. As I said, the point of the Smart Guidelines is to take it to the country level, so there's an adaptation process. So for each of these layers, L1, L2, L3, we do want to build in sort of the processes for adapting. So if we have WHO as a recommendation for immunization for cholera, how does that get applied and adapted in the country, both from a policy and normative guidance level, but also in code. And so how do we ease that process every single time so we don't have so much redundant work that's being done? We have better quality control of the systems that are being deployed. We have ways to audit and say, oh, is your system actually doing as you say it is, right? We've seen lots of cases where vendors are saying, yes, we can do all of these great things, and there's not been any way for a country to say, assess them, and they don't really know what they're getting. So we really want to have a better, clear marketplace, a more transparent marketplace, so that countries can make better, more informed decisions about what digital tools are really going to meet their needs. Okay, so I don't know how real this is, but here you can see sort of our L3 example for immunization, where we're capturing client history for yellow fever. So if you see in here, we have logical models, and we have some structured definitions defining logical models, right? But what we don't have as normative for WHO is the representation of FHIR, right? What we have is guidance on how to represent this in R4, but for us, the logical models are the key things, right? Because there's going to be FHIR R4, there's OpenAir, there's all sorts of different existing information models that are used by countries. So if we focus our decision support, our indicator calculations on logical models, and we have the structure maps to R4, then we can achieve a lot of what we need to do, but do it in a way that both prepares for the future, but is also agnostic to specific country implementation. So we're really trying to maximize the value and what can be extracted from the Smart Guidelines. So here's one example you can see for HIV. We've just published the HIV. It's out for public comment. If you would like to comment, there's now a feedback icon. You just go into the HIV smart guidelines, you click on it, it will either take you to a GitHub issue with a section where you can create an issue and say, hey, this is wrong. And we can say, no, it's not wrong, or yes, it is wrong. So you can actually engage with this in a feedback cycle. If you don't like GitHub, I think probably most of the people here have GitHub, but for those, not everybody is in this room, right? We have, high-level people. There's also a SharePoint form that they can go to that doesn't require GitHub. But so please, smart.wshow.int is where we have all of our smart guidelines, and you can see some linkages to these. To give you sort of a current status or a partially correct, and this slide will never be correct, but of the types of smart guidelines that we're working on, you can see we have antenatal care that's basically fully done, and we have some FHIR-based implementation of that. Family planning, STIs, HIV, actually the L3 is published, yeah, the slide is out of date. Child health and emergency settings, COVID certificates, and we'll talk about on Thursday's session, there's going to be some more about vaccine certificates in general, TB, etc. So we've got a lot going on, a lot of content areas, and our aim is to slowly produce full coverage of primary health care for smart guidelines. That requires money, and I think people have seen the news, so it'll take a while, but we'll get there. If we go to the L2, sort of the requirements, we have a very structured process for capturing from the SMEs requirements. So first of all, the health interventions and the recommendations, these are sort of the publication documentations, but then we go into developing generic personas, user scenarios, business process diagrams, our data dictionary, which is our logical model, decision support logic, there's decision tables, indicators and monitoring, and functional and non-functional requirements. So this has sort of been the current state for structured L2 content development. And what we're seeing now is that we're at a point where we're mature enough where we need a ninth thing, which is really much more structured way to talk about testing scenarios. So testing scenarios for the subject matter expert to say, oh, I see that there's this L3 content or even an L4 an application. How do I know, how do I have reasonable assurance that it's going to perform what it says it does? Is it really going to say if I have a child with a vaccination schedule or vaccination history, that it's going to produce the right next dose suggestion for that? Right, so how do we actually structure from the SMEs to the BAs to describe these scenarios that are typical, which we can guess as developers, but we don't really know, and how do we do that in a structured way so that we can ease that sort of test generation, test scenario development? I don't know how to do this. I think there are a lot of people in the room have ideas of this. This is one of the problems that we need to solve, and I hope that's one of the things that we can talk about this week. There's a lot of things, gaps that we have, there's lots of things to fill in, but again, I thank you as a community for helping us do this together. Just quickly, just to show what we're mapping from L2 to L3. So health interventions, those are just the actual policy recommendations. So the generic personas, well, actor definitions, that makes sense, right? User scenarios, we're not exactly sure. Maybe the example scenario works, it doesn't quite fit. Test plan, test script, example instances. So there's some stuff that we need to do around scenarios and testing. But the processes, we have BPMN diagrams, or sort of our normative L2 artifacts, and then we use those to generate plan definitions, activity definitions in the FHIR world. Data dictionary, we go into FHIR logical models. Logical models are normative things. We have questionnaires. Questionnaires are non-normative. There's just sort of example user interfaces on how you capture data. But the normative thing is the logical model. Structure maps what we need to go from the logical models to various data model representations. Value sets, code systems, obviously, those are sort of defining our core data elements. Decision tables, which we are representing in DMN, those now go into CQL libraries, plan definitions, and then embedded into FHIR library resources. Scheduling logic, DMN tables, again, indicators and measures, FHIR measures, functional requirements, non-functional requirements, or FHIR requirements. So we've got a lot of this, sort of, at least from a SOP process perspective, defined and how we should do this. We now need to work on sort of automated tooling and workflows in order to really do this better. And so, again, this is a call out to you all. If you're interested in this space, please come talk to me about this. We have lots of problems, and we don't have as many hands as some of you all do, and so we need more hands. So where does all this fit? So one of the other initiatives that we're developing is a reference architecture. Why are we doing this? There's a lot of reasons to do this. One is we want to emphasize the role of digital public infrastructure for health. So common core services that exist within health system that then applications can be built upon. This might be a client registry, facility registry, terminology services, sort of the core things that you would want to be there. Not all countries have these, but if we can articulate a reference architecture, sort of an 80-20 rule again, of like sort of the common needs that countries have, then at least we provide some guidance for countries that are going for digital transformation. You have to remember that we're going from countries that are low income to middle income, high income, and we want to have sort of stepping stages of maturity in digital health capability and not create a digital divide. So we need to think through how do we go from like what's the core like infrastructural needs to these higher, fancy things that we're going to be doing with AI in 5 years or next year or next month, who knows. And all these should be built on sort of foundational DPIs, so things that exist maybe not within the health sector, but across government. So digital ID, public key infrastructure, payment services. How do we bring all these things together? We need to articulate so that our health systems are better functioning. I don't know how many times I've walked into a Ministry of Health and they're like, yeah, we need an ID system. Well, okay, but there's other ministries that departments of interior, and like, how do we have these conversations and bring them together and really just understand what these needs are? So some of this is that sort of articulation for countries that are really going through that digital transformation process in the early stages, but also really how to bring these things together. That's one need. The second need is that we operate infrastructure. So there's a trust infrastructure, which we'll talk about tomorrow in the Hodge talk. It's bigger, that WHO operates. We're standing up a terminology service. We're standing up a product catalog. We have a facility registry that we're standing up, all going to be using FHIR standards. So we want to describe within our architecture how we're operating these, what are the assumptions, so that countries, vendors can come in and make use of the assets that we have in the data that we have in this architecture. And finally, we just see, because of the changes in health funding, particularly in the donor funding landscape, there's a lot of countries that are just, the investments that they've made in the years are just crumbling. And so they're looking for how do we reinvent from sort of siloed systems that we had before that are no longer being paid for into sort of the new era of more sustainable funding, something that we can build and not be dependent on one particular donor. And so we've got a lot of needs for this reference architecture. We're not trying to like say this is the most perfect thing, but it is a starting point and it is a place to come. There is also a way to engage on this. If you're interested in this, there's an application form for becoming an expert to contribute to this group. We've just kicked off our core architects over the last month, and we're going to be starting new sort of working groups, working domains. I think coming back to starting what WHO is, I think this is also important for the reference architecture. WHO is an organization driven by member states, and so it's not a private sector organization, it's not actual like national government, so the way that we operate is a little bit different. The way that we engage is we have restrictions on engaging with non-state actors, and so our governance and how we're doing this reference architectures might not be the exact same as you would expect in sort of other communities, but what we do want is to have a large community practice and a large expert pool that can contribute to this. So this is my pitch to you. If you're interested, please do come talk to me. And finally, before we get there, so the last thing we want to do with the architecture is to say, actually, well, this is great, we have all these tools, but do they actually work together? So we're working on compliance testing. And so we're not going to do anything in the architecture that we can't test. And this shows a little bit of overview of like how these things are fitting together in terms of our Smart Guidelines Exchange is our authoring platform or set of scripts that is the strategy, but we have things like the terminology service, we have Open Concept Lab, we have a product catalog management tool that's FHIR and GS1 compliant. We make use of the IG Publisher and GitHub for all of our content hosting. And we have a PKI infrastructure for Trust Network Gateway, but anyways, these sort of components on the Smart Guidelines Exchange, we want to make sure that there's good set of tests for the vendors to run. We're going to be making use of the interoperability test bed from the European Commission, which lets you define in a standardized way various tests. Those can be used by the vendors for sort of pre-connectathon or sandbox testing before they get to a connectathon event or where they're trying to do peer-to-peer testing, for example, with IHE and the Gazelle platform. So all of these things generally fit together, and we've been working with the various communities to make sure that all these things, all these arrows work. But there's still more work to be done and more opportunities to engage here. So finally, AI. We have to have the inevitable slide on AI. So we do have guidance on the use of AI. There's several publications, for example, the Ethics and Governance and Other AI for Health. So these are sort of that's the L1 document, and now we need to think about the L2 and the L3 on how to basically operationalize AI. So this could be content authoring. How do we make it easier to do decision support authoring in CQL? It could be how do we use things like MCP for deterministic to ensure that AI agents interface with deterministic methods such as we would get from decision support table. Can we use the work that we've done on the testing, and if we build out that testing scenarios, we really build out the test infrastructure, let's throw our AI agents at that and actually say, okay, is this model of LLM, how well is it doing in terms of actually adhering to the guidelines? Can we at least start to have that conversation about the safety, and maybe we don't necessarily do guardrails, but at least the lines on the road where we know that the AI agents are going to go off, right? So can we improve our testing to QA, but not do that in a circular way where we're generating test data and asking the AI models to then test themselves, but what can we do to improve the testing and the testing framework, and then the training and the models and the data. So that's all sort of future directions that we'll be starting. There's lots of work to be done. Again, we need all of your participation and support. And thank you for those who've been contributing, even if you know that you haven't. I look forward to meeting all of you this week that I haven't met before. And please share with me what you're doing so that we know and have a good sense of how things that we don't know and how we can bring them into the Smart Guidelines framework. So thank you, and I think there's going to be a Q&A time. I think we're out of time now, but there's a session sidelines.
There's 2 more minutes. So if someone has a burning question, we can address it now. And think about this. Otherwise, at 9:55, indeed, we're meeting here for the meeting brief with Carl, and then tomorrow at 9:05 is your session also in this room on FHIR. Anyone? If not, thank you very much, Carl.
Thank you.